The moment you get hit with critical spirit towards another person, that is a potential gold mine for self-knowledge, because there are going to be these defects that you have been defended against noticing in yourself. You will be able to notice them when you see them in another. So that's what I want people to do is, if you notice yourself being critical, I wouldn't be harsh internally against that. Instead, be curious about it.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at optimwork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at optimwork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, Kevin, no problem. So, Kevin, we've been talking about humility and reviewing Dr. John Gottman's work on the stages of relationship breakdown, which we're trying to see as the breakdown of humility. And we identify their four horsemen of the apocalypse, 4 stages. And we already covered the first last week, defensiveness. And now we're on to the second one to do a deeper dive into that, which is criticism.
And now in Gottman's writing, he actually has criticism first and then defensiveness second. But I don't think that there's anything magical about that ordering. And I think our ordering is better because we start with the internal feeling of defensiveness. And once it gets to a certain peak, it goes on counterattack. So in defensiveness, we're kind of fleeing from the insights that show us, in fact, where we could grow. We're fleeing from responsibility. So defensiveness is all about denial and minimizing and rationalizing. But eventually it actually does reach this point of counterattack. And that's where it becomes criticism. Maybe better to say critical spirit, because I think it's this deeper habit. It's a negative fixation, on the defects of another person.
Yeah. So would you say that someone who has critical spirit, by definition, is also going to be defensive? If maybe it's easier to notice that, I'm being a little bit critical about other people, but you didn't notice any defensiveness. Could you assume that, okay, therefore there must be some defensiveness, maybe I just haven't picked up on it yet?
I think in our own case, we will all at first say, no, I'm not being defensive. And isn't that really the whole trick of defensiveness? That it's like defensiveness brings with it a set of defenses against noticing defensiveness. So the main move of defensiveness is to be in denial and to be minimizing. Well, you're going to deny and minimize defensiveness. And so I really think that oftentimes our own defensiveness really blinds us to ourselves. So and to really seeing where we could grow. So many times we cannot see a defect in ourselves until we actually start seeing it in another. And if it bothers us, and if we're really annoyed by it, and we can tell that emotionally we're just reacting, that might be a sign then that, this is actually this dynamic at play. If we develop a negative fixation on a defect of another, so that when we see the person, we really are just seeing the defect, well, then we can be sure that we've fallen into this. And I think that, yes, this is a way of being defensive.
Mm-hmm. And so, I think it's great to get into do this dive into criticism. And I think, one of the things we'll see is, I think this is your kind of reframing of criticism, is that it provides insight for you. If you notice that you're being critical in some way, it provides very valuable self-knowledge to you. And we can.
Absolutely. The moment you get hit with critical spirit towards another person, that is a potential gold mine for self-knowledge. Because there are going to be these defects that you have been defended against noticing in yourself. You will be able to notice them when you see them in another. So that's what I want people to do is, if you notice yourself being critical, I wouldn't be harsh internally against that. Instead, be curious about it. Try to be playful and curious when you notice yourself going critical. And then I think it opens up really just deep caverns of self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So, Kevin, when we're talking about critical spirit, I guess there are two parts here. One is, I mean, we always kind of break things down this way, but like there's the internal part of it and then the external part of it, the behavior. We're actually expressing it maybe to someone else. How much can we do actually to reduce the internal part of it? Because it seems like that is the heart of it. This having this internal spirit of criticism towards other people, but at the same time, that seems really hard to change. And I think a common piece of advice would be like, well, you're human and you're going to have negative thoughts about other people, and that's fine. It just is what it is. The important thing is what you do about it. So how much do you agree with that? Like kind of strict, hey, whatever happens inside, you can't control that. I mean, but.
Well, one thing is, when we talk about being critical of others, we're not talking about noticing the defects of others. So that has to happen because everyone has defects and we're going to probably notice them at some point. What we're talking about is more of this internal emotional reaction, and a hyper focus of attention. So I think that this idea of critical spirit, ultimately, it really is a cognitive distortion where our way of seeing someone has gotten warped in some negative way. And so that I think is something that we can always own. Now, that may very well be the case that our own selves, we've been warped in how we see ourselves, and and I also think that we can have an inner critic. Not everyone has an inner critic. Maybe it's like, I don't know, 70% of people, but that means there's a sizable number of people who would never experience an inner critic. And so I think that's normal. That's a normal variant. Having a critic, not having. I think that the skills you learn, though, in dealing with your own inner critic can teach you how to handle criticizing others, because probably it's the same thing. When you're critical of yourself for certain things, you're going to tend to be critical, with others on those same things. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say,
yeah,
it's different than an ordinary negative thought about someone.
Right. And you've linked it to these cognitive distortions, and correct me if I'm wrong, but our concept of reframing comes from an earlier concept of cognitive restructuring, which is meant to deal with these cognitive distortions.
Exactly.
So when we're talking now about these cognitive distortions, like hyper-focusing on one negative point of a person, which is just saying this characterizes them when it doesn't, is a cognitive distortion. Is reframing the solution to that?
Yeah. So all of them are all the cognitive distortions are going to be overcome by reframing. But if you start thinking of what did Aaron Beck list originally, as the cognitive distortions, they really apply to being critical of others. So all or nothing thinking. So you kind of see someone as completely the defect, that it summarizes them totally. Magnification, mental filtering. So you filter out the positive, discounting the positive, emotional reasoning, overgeneralize. There's all these distortions that we can have. They all are a kind of hyperfocus. It's like a lens that's melted, and so now it magnifies in some areas and minimizes in others. They all come down to equating a person with a defect that they might have, with a defect that we see in them, such that when we see the person, now we're just seeing the defect. I like to think of it as synecdoche. Synecdoche is a literary device where you use a part to stand for the whole, or vice versa. But in this case, you see a person as if they're just the defect. And when you say hi to the person, it's like the defect that you're saying hi to. So your whole experience is mediated in some way, by this distorted way of thinking. The synecdoche really means having a simultaneous understanding in the Greek. And that's what happens when we're overly annoyed with people. Somehow whatever we don't like has come to, that is now taking the place of the real whole person. So I think that we are summarizing them you could say, in this one defect.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's interesting that when we talked about defensiveness and we talked that the growth mindset is like the opposite approach or opposite attitude you can have. And it seems like in this case, being critical of someone else, it's like you have a fixed mindset for them. Like you're just identifying them with this trait and they can't change. They'll always be, characterized by this one trait. So it's like fixed mindset now projected onto another person is like this.
That's exactly right. And I think that the fixed mindset always has these left brain characteristics because it's really about our model. And we're not seeing the person anymore. What we're seeing is our model of the person. And really it's a fragment of the model that now by synecdoche is standing for the whole. So we have some fixed thing in how we see this person, and that becomes the entire mediator of our experience of that person. So yeah, it's very left brain. The right brain deals with wholes. The right brain can handle the idea of growth. So fixed versus growth mindset in ourself then also applies to fixed versus growth mindset with others. I think this is also one of those reasons why the more we're dominated by an inner critic, the more critical we would tend to be of others, because we'd have a fixed view of ourselves. And so we tend to have a fixed view of others. But the right brain deals with wholes. It deals with trajectories. It deals with growth. So we are really working on ourselves to be growing in different ways, and to be grateful for opportunities to grow. We can actually learn to apply that same idea to others and to be grateful for them as well.
Mm-hmm. So, I think there's another element to this that we want to discuss of projection. So maybe we could, Kevin, you could elaborate on that, that was synecdoche. You had identified as like, these are the two main ways of being critical of others. And then we can, after that, dive into a little bit more of, hey, what do you do about this?
Now, I have to say that as a therapist trained by Aaron Beck and Judith Beck, I was not on board with the idea of projection for a long time. It's a Freudian idea. It means that if there's something that you are unwilling to experience in yourself, then you may, as a defense, project that onto others so that now that's how you see them. So you attribute to others the very parts of yourself you don't want to admit.
So that's Freudian. It has like a subconscious kind of thing going on.
That's totally Freudian. Okay. Yeah.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support.
Also, that there's this idea called projective identification, which is that we will tend to act according to the things that others project us to be. So if I'm always treating someone as if they are unreliable and disloyal, well, more and more they're going to feel this kind of, they're going to become more unreliable and disloyal. And this very interesting ideas, and I've seen them at work in people's lives. And there is this deep sense now that I have that projection does happen. And I think that there's two interesting ways I have of reconciling this with my CBT credentials. One of them is Carl Friston and his idea of predictive processing theory, and which I've talked about before here, but just to say it briefly, that in order to better predict the world around us, we use an internal model to make predictions. And that internal model then gets corrected when we make errors, through a process called prediction error correction. So when it comes to predicting the intentions of other people, we tend to use ourselves as the model for that, which means we end up writing, you could say, our own inner model of how we are and how we operate into how we see other people and how they operate. Well, isn't that a lot like projection? That we are using ourself as the basis because that's our experience of reality, is our own, our model of how the world works is inseparable from our model of ourself and how we operate in that world. And so we believably, I think it's right. We predict other people's mental states based on our own internal model of ourself. This is a big problem, for instance, in primate research. And so the best primatologists have struggled with this. We will always tend to read into what the chimpanzees are doing, and why they're doing it, based on our own human experience. It's very hard to see past that. And I think the best primatologists have done that. So I think that, people can check out Folk Physics for Apes if they're interested, or How Chimpanzees Think the World Works. Those are great books about how do you overcome this built-in tendency we have to project our humanity into primates and other animals as well, I'm sure. Anyway, so there's this idea that projection could just be a modeling phenomenon, and so Augustine is another interesting source, though. In one of his commentaries on the Psalms, he says that we should try to acquire the virtues that we believe are lacking in others, because then we will no longer see their defects, because we will no longer have them ourselves. So if we think something is lacking and they have a defect, we should first then work on it in ourselves. Interesting that Augustine had the idea of projection. That is when these unnoticed defects that we have, we see written in others. It is the idea that, before taking the speck out of our brother's eye, we should take the plank out of our own eye. So there's a deeply kind of evangelical, theme there. But Augustine does also, you could say, anticipate this predictive processing theory, that when we grow in virtue, our model for the world gets updated. And so our experience of others gets updated. And we tend to be then more willing to see the best in others and to make excuses for others and to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Kevin, so the idea here is that when we see people doing something,
Mm-hmm.
we're projecting back of what their own interior mental state was when they did that, but we don't really know that because we don't have some sophisticated brain scanner. So we just project what we think our own mental state would have been in doing that.
Yeah. So if you think of someone who's always trying to scam others, it is going to always feel like he's being scammed. So, and if someone never does try to scam others, they always try to come up with the most honest, price or fair exchange, then they're going to tend to see others in that way. Now, all of this we're talking about here is at the level of the automatic judgments that we make. I think we can come through experience to learn how to prudently discern reality and what's the safest way of attributing. And I think even then we would have to say, as a rule of prudence, it's always better to assume the best of people, because it's very uncommon that people are knowingly bad toward us. So if we're, I think that it's always the case that we should give people the benefit of the doubt. And that I think actually is the most prudent and loving thing to do. But it's also just what we know of how our automated judgments work. We tend to see ourselves in others. And so if we constantly are seeing the same kind of defects in others, well, maybe we have to first then remove that from ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So so if we had to get into hey, these, if you observe critical spirit in yourself in some way, these are the things that you should think about doing in order to, help you grow in humility, help to improve your relationships with other people. So one is, work on the areas that you see that you think you're being critical of others in regards to. And then can we, what are there any other things that we'd recommend? I mean, that's already the project of a lifetime, but.
Yes, exactly. I think that fundamentally there are two things. And so as regards ourselves, we have to own the opportunity for growth. So if we're seeing defects in others, then we try to see, how can I examine myself in this same point? And my experience has been that if I'm in some way annoyed or bothered by a defect in someone, every time I have very evident uh, ways of expressing that same defect that I hadn't noticed before. I just feel our defensiveness is so defended against, we just don't see it. Even if we're working very actively on growing and have a growth mindset, it's still the case. We do not see all of our opportunities to grow. And so sometimes the only time we can notice big new vistas for growing are when we get critical of some things and others. So the first thing, own the opportunity to grow. That kind of corresponds then to this idea of taking responsibility, contrition, love trying to put things right. In my own case, then I'm gonna own completely how I can grow here. But then the second thing is equally important, and that is to really appreciate the good in the other person. To be asking okay, can I be grateful for this person in my life? Gratitude in some way is the most direct way of going against critical spirit. If critical spirit is a narrowing of our focus, a distortion in our thinking that needs to be widened, well, gratitude then is reframing in practice. Trying to get to a place where you can be grateful for the other is a way of almost reaching into your mind and widening the lens manually. So if you try to get to the point where you're truly grateful for the other person being in your life, it forces you to overcome this identifying the person with the defect. So to seeing all the other things. And many times, once we get ourselves grateful for the person, the other thing seems either so trivial, it's best to be let go of, or we're able to see 10 other reasons they could be doing it that we hadn't thought of. Somehow we've gotten locked into one way of viewing. So I think like contrition, I think gratitude moves us to the right hemisphere and allows us to appreciate wholes and to build bonds and to really be in touch and in sync with other people more. So many times, if we just get ourselves grateful for the person, then the criticalness goes away. Maybe the last step is, if there's actually something for them to grow in, well, then we should find a way, if it's appropriate, to lovingly do that. So that if our relationship is such that we could, so if it's an employee that you have, or, well, then I think if you're the boss, you would want to be able to help them to grow. But at that point, now that you're grateful for them as a whole, you're going to be much better able to leverage their strengths and to explain how they can grow in terms of growing on the strength that they have. So you always want to have their strengths in view, to see all their good qualities. Then you can help them connect the dots to see, okay, this would just be a way of building that strength. But many times, I think if it's a parent, I don't think we should ever, be, of course, critical of our parents. And I also don't think it's our business really to help our parents grow. I think that when it comes, I think that we just try to be as loving and supportive with our parents as we can. And anyway, so I think it depends on the relationship. How are you actually helping people to grow?
Maybe stepping back a little bit, Kevin, in terms of your kind of philosophy of how you approach helping other people grow, it seems like sometimes a person can have the approach like, okay, you just notice a lot of things that are wrong with a person and you try to get rid of them or something, like how to hack away bad habits or bad actions or whatever. But it seems like what we're proposing here is actually to help someone grow, it's more about building up something positive, and you have to build on like a good foundation. So you have to identify what's the good things of the other person to actually help positive growth, as opposed to just identifying all these bad things and trying to get rid of them.
Yeah, exactly. And I really think one of the hardest experiences is to be corrected by someone that you don't think actually likes you. So if you have the feeling they don't like you at all, and now they're telling you something, that's very hard, I think. I think that we, and if we're trying to help others to grow, we should be extreme. If we don't really like the person and feel like we can see all the good in them, and like that they're in our life, and and there's a real bond with them, I think we should then not mention things. I think that or let someone else, just there needs to be another way, because I don't, a cold correction is in some sense the cruelest thing. And I think it really does hurt people. So ideally, we are trying to see the good in others. We're trying to have a playful, curious, engaged spirit, get to know people, form bonds with them. And then that bond is the context for all real help when it comes to helping others to grow.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Kevin, I wonder if we're kind of closing in here on the finish time, but I wonder if you could just help tie this a little bit more explicitly back into humility.
Yeah.
Because we've touched on a lot of subjects, so I'd like to just see the kind of whole package in terms of critical spirit, but also humility.
I think so. When we're grateful for others, we are more willing to learn from them. And so gratitude directly helps us to grow in humility. It's good to, I think, admit that we're all tempted to be overly critical from time to time. But that is a moment that allows for very profound growth. That as long as we're humble, that means we can admit our mistakes and where we have to grow on that very same point, and that we can actually be grateful for others and be able and willing to learn from them. So contrition, we said before, is a great measure of our humility. Our ability to actually be contrite and take responsibility out of love, well, that's a wonderful expression of humility. But gratitude is also this great measure of humility, because it means that we can see the good in others, and that actually then allows us to really learn from them. There's this beautiful thing too that, in a way, when it comes to like any kind of growth, any kind of mastery, we have to first admit that we need to grow. And then second, we have to be willing to learn from the experience of others. And those are just fundamental to any kind of growth, any kind of mastery that we want to develop. And so it's great that, we will tend to not notice the ways we can improve, and that's because of our defensiveness. So humility allows us to admit our strategies need improving for everything. We can get better at everything. And then this idea of being grateful for others, well, that allows us to learn from them. And we can admit that others do things in admirable ways. And if we really had the right vision and the right eyes, we could learn from everyone around us. So I think those are two profound aspects of humility.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. Thanks so much. This is a great synthesis, and I look forward to discussing the third stonewalling next in our next episode.
Yeah, I think it's about to get a little bit deeper, I think. So we'll stay tuned.
I'll prepare. I have a week to prepare mentally for this. Okay. All right. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Sharif.
We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out optimwork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.